What's up, y'all? It's Cousin Chet. Here with Dill again. Let's get us squared up there. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Thanks for all the love. Thanks for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. Thanks for the views. I'm really excited because this is going to be episode 17 for me. I don't know exactly how many Dill has done with me, but I'm just adding to it. And so I really appreciate everybody that's liking, that's following, that's coming over to follow the YouTube, that's following Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we're going to keep growing from here. So, Dill and I have been doing podcasts pretty consistently. We record on Mondays, and then I post it when I can sometime during the week. And I'm really grateful because, I think being that you're kind of from a rural background, a conservative background, shall I say a white European background, and then later on today, I'm going to do an episode with Just and Tone, who are going to give me a totally different perspective. And one reason why it's important to me is because both of those perspectives are what make me, are part of what make me. There's also a Hispanic perspective that is actually unraveled for me, but those three contexts are part of my perspective and part of where I come from, right? I come from Appalachian people on my dad's side, very hillbilly, redneck, if you want to call them that, whatever. We're talking about poor Appalachian white people from the hills. And then my grandmother, who for lack of a better term, because she doesn't like this term, but is Hispanic. Her culture comes from the Hispanic, being in the Hispanic culture. And even though she didn't teach it to me that way, as an adult, I recognize that now and how it's different from the other cultures I've been around. And then thirdly, as has been mentioned in other podcasts, I graduated from a majority black high school. I've dated black women the majority of my life. And so that influence is definitely part of my overall perspective. And one of the things that I want to do with podcasting is to bring those perspectives about. As Just has said, he's like, Chet, you should tell your story. And part of why why I want to set this up the way I'm setting it up is I am telling my story. And I'm telling my story by telling the story and communicating with people that share those portions of my perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're very extroverted, so you like synergy.
Well,
I think you're drawn to synergy.
That is very perceptive. I think that I'm going to reword that a little bit because I think you're really onto something that's important for me in my mental health and my personal being and being who I am. And one of that is to be in integrity with who I am. And that integrity is synergizing all of those perspectives into this one person, right? And being myself in each of those contexts where I've pulled from and have family and love in all of those contexts. But we talked about tradition the other day, mm-hmm. And there's some value in having a solid tradition, having solid culture. I think especially for the ego and just for ourselves, understanding our place in the world, just like we talked about traditions, how important that is to knowing and being oneself. Understanding where you come from, the perspectives you've been taught, right? Mm-hmm. And then for me, because they're compartmentalized, right? This part is in this part of my life. This part is in this part of my life, and so as a person who thinks a lot, I have a lot to pull from. I pull from all of those perspectives. Now, that doesn't mean I know anything. I'm not here to say I'm not racist because I have black friends. I'm not here to say that I'm Hispanic because my grandmother was, although legally and technically I am, and I am attracted to that. But you know, I'm white. I mean, I'm just white, Ohio, American mutt, you know. And so, so to bring it into conversation with you, as I was thinking about that earlier today and last night preparing for our podcast today, one of the differences that I feel with you is that you represent a different rural white than what I actually came from. Because I feel like you didn't come from money per se, but you came from a good stability, grandparents that owned property.
I kind of grew up in an ivory tower.
Explain
In a
that
lot
for
of
me.
ways. I mean, for one, we were literally living on a hill. It was a private family estate, and it was a giant wooded area. So there wasn't a lot of money to go around growing up.
Mm-hmm.
But everything was pretty much covered.
Mm-hmm.
And we were homeschooled for the most part, so it was kind of up far away from everybody else, kind of lonely. Like, you kind of learn to entertain yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then jumping into high school, going from being basically homeschooled all the way up to the end of middle school, the only real like branching out I'd done in my area was going to football practice. So when I got to high school, I had the football thing. So it was like, I kind of had this like social shield. I had buddies. I belonged to like a faction of the school in some ways.
Sure.
That was, it didn't really even occur to me until the end of high school, but it was like that kind of smoothed things over for me.
Yeah.
Like transitioning to public school.
Are you saying that because you had a group that you fit in, social group that you fit in?
Yeah, I automatically was like, oh yeah, he's one of the football players. So you kind of have a persona before having a persona.
Sure.
So like other than that though, other than football, going to public school for the first time, like it was extremely nerve-wracking because everybody else, like there was just a little something, like everybody else grew up seeing each other in class, same time, every day, 5 days a week for like the last 10 years.
Sure. They grew up together, so to speak.
Yeah, and even if they didn't, they moved schools, but it was the same formula, different place. But like, I had to I kind of came at things from an outsider's perspective. Like I might have played football, but even when it came to football, like I'd play it. There was something rewarding about the knockdown, drag out aspect of it, and I was able to keep up mentally, like with playbooks and making plans. But it was like, I never really watched football. Like, I would sit down and watch it because everybody else in the family would, but it was like, there was something, it didn't grab me. Like, the sense of tradition never, like, it never sunk in for me. Like, that specific tradition of Sunday morning, everybody goes to church, and then Sunday afternoon, everybody hangs out and watches the game. It just that never clicked for me. But it felt like I've always been coming at things from an outsider's perspective. Like, that started in high school, and then when I went to college, I kind of, by that point, I felt like I was, for the first couple of years, I felt like I was pretty much on the same page with everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until about junior, senior year of college before I realized I was taking something away from college.
Mm-hmm.
That most people, I was looking for something at college, whereas everybody else kind of seemed like they already had their mind made up what they were doing,
Mm-hmm.
like, while they were there. Whether that was like to party,
Sure.
whether that was to party and fuck around, or whether that was because I'm gonna curate my own museum someday. I'm gonna get an internship in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I felt more like an outsider leaving college than I went into college with. Because I'm not trying to suck myself off here either, but I mean, like, I felt like I went to college because I wanted an actual education.
Yeah.
Like, I wanted to actually improve myself here so that when I leave and I go out to the rest of the world, I have some tools in my belt. I wanted to kind of figure out my identity.
Mm-hmm.
One way or another. Like, I wanted my identity. And I felt like that was something I was going to have to sweat and bleed for a little bit in college. And not beyond just, like, taking exams and shit. I mean, like, I was seriously going to, like, question, like, everything. I was going to question myself, and I was going to get answers to my questions where I could get them.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to bring this back around, like, I did kind of live up in an ivory tower for most of my childhood. Like, it was lonely.
Yeah.
It was full of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was trying to imagine what everything else outside the tower was.
Sure. But so one of the things that I'm looking to distinguish from my rural white background is that I come from poor Appalachia, and I come from a lot of dysfunction. So the generation before me has an Army vet that probably had some pretty severe PTSD, and he just put his nose to the grindstone, and he may not have paid a lot of attention to his kids, but he was a hard worker, and he worked all his life, and he got married, and he stayed married to that woman until she passed away, and then I had an uncle that was a crackhead, for many years, and potentially, I don't know if he actually did this, but maybe got his daughters into prostitution to help his crack addiction. Each of his children suffer and deal with addiction issues and or excuse me, and or they are in and out of prisons, in and out of rehabs, things like that. And so I come from a very impoverished Appalachian background from that perspective. And I don't feel like you came from poverty.
No.
You said you lived on an ivory tower. Like, the fact that you classify it as, even though it's out in the middle of the woods and it's more like a maple tree tower.
It's more a tree house.
A tree house. Yeah, but nonetheless, this is you refer to it as a family estate, right? Like were there days as a child where you wondered, what are we going to eat today?
No.
And when you came to the decision, like, when did you come to the decision that you would attend college? Was that your decision?
It really wasn't. In fact, within the first year or two at college, I remember making a comment to a bunch of different family members. I was like, I've been listening to a few different people, and I've been thinking about it. I don't really know what I'm doing here at college. Maybe I would be better off spending my time getting a trade and then studying on my own time and trying to work this stuff out. That seems like it might be, but everybody was always like, "Oh, well, you haven't even been in that long. Like, just give it another year or two. You'll figure it out." And then I waited another year or two, and then everybody's like, "You're in so far. Like, you're basically almost done. Just finish it." That was that was how it felt.
Sure.
Anyways,
And
but
that is part of what makes your experience unique to you, right? Because sure, you're white, sure, you're raised in the fundamental Christian, but not everybody, even in your localized area, not everybody's homeschooled. As you said, there's a local high school that you attended, and those kids had grown up with each other and were part of the popular culture of the school or whatever have you, right?
well,
And not all of those kids went to college, and so I'm assuming some of those kids in that school were poor. I mean, I'm sure there were poor people in your high school.
yeah, there were poor kids. Yeah, there were poor kids, and funny enough, the longer I went to high school, the more I found like those were the people I usually got along best with because they didn't usually come with agendas. I don't know, it just, the vibe was different. Like, you could kind of relax and just shoot the shit. You could just tell a joke.
Yeah.
Like, around kids who, like, kind of lived in the shittier part of town, of Urbana or wherever. Yeah. Anyways, but
Easier said than done, isn't it?
yeah, easier said than done, especially today, apparently. But no, I remember what I was gonna say now. Well, like, for instance, I didn't grow up wondering if there was gonna be anything to eat. But we kind of grew up like, Dad worked third shift, and Mom's always been like, just a busy bee. Anyways, whether she was working a part-time job or whether she was coordinating big, like, networks of people, nonprofits, like, that's always been her wheelhouse. But we didn't grow up wondering if there'd be anything to eat, but we kind of grew up with, well, if you're hungry, like, go get some food. Like, make your own food, get it.
Yeah.
Like, it's there. Fridge is
Right.
there for a reason. So,
Right.
but I say all that, the point I was really trying to get at was, it wasn't like I grew up without an awareness that we were really lucky,
Yeah.
that we were really well off. And that's because of, like I said, like, all the nonprofits my mom would be wheeling and dealing with, one of which was Angel Tree. And the Angel Tree kids were local Springfield kids or kids from Dayton. I'm trying to remember where else is, like, that Springfield, Dayton area, like, these big, like, central, like, inner cities of Midwest Ohio. We'd bus these kids in, and I would meet them. There's always, like, 2 weeks a year where it was like, all right, these 2 weeks are only about the kids that have less than we do.
Yeah.
And funny enough, I think I can remember. It's probably not the first because I got an aunt. But as far as my personal memory bank goes, I can remember the first black guy I ever met.
Really?
Or ever saw.
Ever saw? Tell me about this.
And I'll never forget. I was, like, walking around our big estate because everybody was showing up for, I think it was somebody's dad. But I remember this guy comes out, and it was like, he was the most I didn't have any stereotypes in my head. I was like 5 or 6.
Okay.
There were no stereotypes in my head. looking back though, this guy like fit every stereotype in the
Really?
book. He had his cap turned backwards. He had a do-rag under it. He had a big old chain swinging around. He had this big baggy tracksuit. And I'll never forget just walking around, and this guy was like headed towards like the building where everybody was meeting and greeting.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, he just kind of looked at me real quick, and it like, I remember being like, oh shit, who's this stranger? And he goes, what's up, man? Hey, give me some. So I like held out my hand, and he did the whole rigmarole, and he was like, nah, man, you'll get it. You're so white. And he just kept moving on. And I remember sitting there like, I remember dwelling on that for the rest of the day. What's so white about me? Like, what did I do?
Because you went.
Yeah. But it was like I said, that was, as far as I can remember, that was probably somebody's dad. But
Sure.
It was like his kids were the ones that I hung out with for the rest of the week. And when I say it felt like living in an ivory tower, I think that's why it felt like that. Is because it's like I kind of had this awareness of everything's good here. Everything's Shangri-La for the most part. There's food in the fridge. There's water, that comes out of the tap when you twist it. Probably like nothing dangerous is actually gonna, nothing dangerous, nothing life-threatening. Aside from like the wrong person showing up at the camp. I don't know. My point is like, it was very removed. I think you were I think the way you grew up seems more indicative of the public school education, the meat grinder of you take all these people and all their kids and you kind of shove them together, and it's like you're just kind of stuck figuring it out with each other, like you're in it. Like you're in it from day one. You're running, you're riding your bikes down to the creek with your buddies, or
you come the ivory tower that you speak of, right, where you have everything you need. You don't really, you don't really want for much. At least on the basic level, right? Mm-hmm. And there's food in the refrigerator, there's water in the tap, there's going to be heat in the winter, right? Where you're going to live, right? That this is your space, right? Now you may have this large space, this family estate, where you invite the less fortunate, right? Yeah. That you then care for, right? So you're
well, it's like we understood that like our grandparents, like our broader family, they didn't come from money.
Sure.
They earned it.
Yeah.
And then they saved like motherfuckers until like they finally were like, hey, we found this giant property that we want our family to have. And it was like it was always thought of as like the family nest egg. It was like, we got this big piece of real estate, and we worked hard for that. So it was,
and that's a very tradition. That's kind of like what a lot of, and people may think, oh, white people are rich. I don't think you were rich per se. I think that you had generational wealth that somebody worked very hard for, and then it provided you a station in the ivory tower to then live the life that you've lived, that your parents got to live their life. And it's not that they were rich. Your dad is his job, if I understand it correctly, is a pretty blue collar, it's not a high paying, he's not, making millions of dollars a year.
My dad's dad was a traveling preacher.
Okay.
There wasn't a lot of money going around there.
And so, I really want to make sure that we don't, you're not Paris Hilton. You're not, this isn't lifestyles of the rich and famous.
Yeah.
It's
not even suburban.
Well, no, it's not suburban at all, but it's also, it's not like silver spoon in mouth wealth, right? You're still having to work. You're still blue collar. You're still
Well, I guess for lack of a better word, there's a tradition you're expected to. There's a tradition we were expected to meet.
mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, you go out and earn your living, you earn your keep. If I had $1 for every time I heard the phrase "earn your living by the sweat of your brow,"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, this isn't silver spoon wealth. This is just
Yeah.
a wealth that says I am able to live in the ivory tree house, right, on the hill, and we have enough that we, because of the work of our grandparents and the work of our parents, we are exposed to. Excuse me. But your exposure to the poverty. See, I'm the kid that's invited to the camp.
Yeah.
Right? I come from that kind of poverty. I come from the poverty that says, we don't know what we're going to eat tonight. We don't know what we're going to eat tomorrow. We don't even know if we're going to be able to live here tomorrow. Matter of fact, winter time's here. We're moving out. We're going to move in with grandma because we can't afford to heat the house through the winter,
Yeah.
right? Man, I got a stretch in the back of my throat. Now, there's portions of wealth that I think people don't consider. You have both your parents growing up; they're still together, right? My mom's been married 3 times. You are the oldest of your family, your brothers and sisters. How, out of curiosity, how old are your parents when you're born?
They're about my age. At least Dad was.
So mid-20s. Right. My mom's
was.
15.
Yeah.
My mom was 15 when I'm born, right? She turned 16 a couple months later, but she's pregnant her whole 15 years. My dad's 19. They're divorced by the time I'm 5. We're talking heavy violence in the household. Those things that come with that type of poverty, right? The drug use, right? The lack of direction, the lack of support,
just gritting your teeth and being on edge,
surviving. And as a kid in that scenario, I mean, I'm like a cat on a tin roof in a freaking tornado, and I've got one nail holding on to a nail.
Yeah.
And I know that as long as I don't move, this is as safe as I can be.
Yeah. But
But if I move a little bit, if I even twitch a muscle, it could all be gone, and I'm sliding and slipping off to oblivion again. But so I want to recognize that there's that subtle difference, right? There's a subtle difference of, just because we have a similar white rural background, that doesn't always mean the same thing for everybody. Remember last week I'm talking about, opening perspectives and realizing that just because this is my perspective doesn't mean it's your perspective.
Yeah.
Even though we have some, on paper, right? We could, we could put them in this box and we can label this box white rural culture, white, you know what I mean? And it wouldn't be that hard, but there's some significant differences in the way that the world was presented to us, and the safety that we had, the comfort that we had, the security, right? I think that's a big deal. And so, for me, let me kind of back it up, because up to the 5th grade, I'm sure I had seen a black person. Whether or not I had interacted with a black person, I doubt it. In the 5th grade, we had a black family move into my local neighborhood. And I remember that my school actually had an assembly, right? They called everybody down to the auditorium and they said, hey, we're going to have a black family that's moving in, and y'all need to be cool, right? Like, literally. Like, I remember this as a kid.
80s?
Yeah. So, this would have been like 89 or something like that. Or no, not 89. What am I talking about? This would have been, bro, we're talking about 79, 80. You know what I mean? Like, I'm 5 years old in 79. Oh my God, I'm not supposed to tell you how old I am. But anyway, so yeah, and I remember, so for me, So another difference for me is I've got this very Hispanic grandmother that I don't realize is Hispanic. What I do know it some, right? I know that her first language is Spanish. I know that we do a lot of things that other white people don't, like we eat more burritos and tortillas and cilantro and shit like that. But it's never really expressly, given to me. There's little tidbits, but it's never expressly like this is our culture, this is who we are kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so there was always a part of me that especially before I could pinpoint it, that I felt a little different, right? Because I'm like, I'm just a little different. I'm like, I do, like we think different. I'm a little different. I got a different perspective that my grandmother's given me. And she's such a powerful, influential part of my life, especially at that age. And so this black family moves in. There's, if I can recall correctly, I think there were two children. One was a girl who was in my grade, and then there was a boy who was actually in the middle school. Now, they lived one street around the corner from me. And I am not going to try to explain what occurred, but what happens is I end up walking that girl to school every day. Probably talked her ear off. I didn't realize that I was protecting her in many ways, that I had probably stopped a lot of bullying that she may have received had she walked alone.
Just having some camouflage, so to speak.
And well, just people going, it throws the whole thing off, right? Not, I'm in the 5th grade. I'm not like Billy Badass. I'm not, you know what I mean? I'm not walking around like I'm a bodyguard. My situation, I think majority of it was just curiosity.
Yeah.
Which I think is indicative of the rest of my life. This curiosity, this wanting to know other people, other cultures, and appreciating things like that.
That is temperamental, in my opinion.
It is part of my temperament. Yes, definitely. It's a very large part of my search and seeking and understanding the world, is being able to be open to that my perspective isn't the only one, that there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak, and that there's a lot of different ways that people live their lives, and that if I base my knowledge on the stereotypes that are taught in history books and from other perspectives, that I'm likely to miss out on a lot.
Yeah.
And misunderstand.
There's just a lot to know. So it's like, what's the use in going in with all these precepts?
Yeah. And like, I'm human, right? I still have, I think anybody in the world is going to, the first time you meet somebody, you're going to size them up, right? You're going to look at shoes to head to toe. You're going to look at how they stand. You're going to look at what they're dressing. You're going to, listen to how they speak. Do they make eye contact? We all do that. It's natural. It's part of being human. But I think it's important to recognize that so we can tear that immediate response down and open the door. So what happens is after the 5th grade, so that family ends up moving out. Sadly, somebody burned a cross. Literally, somebody burned a cross in their front yard, and they moved out immediately. And later on that year, I also moved out. My mom had met a young man, and we moved in with him, and we moved to a school that was near an Air Force base. And so that school had a lot more diversity. There were Hispanics, there were Asian Filipinas, there were Filipinas, and there was a small group of black kids in the school. If I'm gonna break it down to probably maybe 10%, of the classes, enough that we had our own hallway before classes where we all hung out, shot the shit. We had our own table, and I'm saying we because this is who I was hanging out with.
Yeah.
And I can't say now that doesn't come. The reason why I'm hanging out with this group of people is not because of curiosity. It's because of the reality of my situation. Where I lived around a lot of black kids. The people that were able to come outside and play with me were black kids, right? You know, we rode to school together. We sat on the back of the bus, you know, because it wasn't. I remember thinking, I'm like, why do y'all want to sit in the back of the bus so much? You're like, you know, Rosa Parks fought so hard, and they're like, fuck all that. We own this bus. We sit in the back because we're cool. This is where the cool people hang out, is in the back of the bus. You know what I mean? It's this they're kind of flipping things on top of themselves, so to speak. Anyhow, and so I'm there at that school, in that school district, for several years before I ultimately end up moving to a school that is majority black. This is a school that, you know, I remember sitting around counting one day in Spanish class, and I'm like, there's 7 white kids for a class of 30, you know? And the reality of that school is most of the white kids would leave their junior and senior year to go off to the tech schools and the trade schools. Some of those did that because they couldn't handle being in such a black context. That school was not an inner city school. It was kind of next to, and there were a lot of inner city kids that would come in and out of that school. But a majority of these kids were looking at kind of like a middle class black community. You know, don't get me, there's a whole variety, but you know, the same things that I saw in my white school, where you had your what we would call the hoods, right? The people that got in trouble. Well, in this school, it's the gangsters, right? And then you had, in the white school, you had your preppies. Well, in the black school, I don't know what they called them, but there was definitely a class of people that had more money than other people, and they could, you know what I mean? They played sports, and they had cars, and they had means and ends, you know what I mean? And so they were similar to the preppies that were in my white school. And that was, I mean, one of the biggest eye-opening things to me, and one of the biggest lessons in my personal perspective of people, is realizing that you can't judge somebody based on their skin color. Like, there are certain cultural things, but even those things, like the culture of a black person from the Midwest can be different than a culture from a black person that grows up in Arizona. And the culture of a poor black person compared to the culture of a black person who had parents or grandparents like yours that had, you know, built the nest egg, right? That created generational wealth. And so, anyway, I wanted to give that background because we were talking about kind of school, and your school experience is very unique. I'm trying to do this. Hold on real quick. I'm trying to do this thing where I want to talk to you right here instead of doing this.
Oh, okay.
And I'm reminding myself right now, because somebody was watching my stuff and they said, Chet, talk to the camera. And I'm like, it's hard.
Okay.
And I'm like, how can I do this? And then I did it. I always totally going off for it.
I always figured that's off-putting, having somebody look at the camera.
No, actually, I think it's the best, because we have to treat this as we're talking to the audience.
Okay, I got you.
Hey, audience.
Hey.
Thanks for the time out. While we're taking this time out, let's take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Make some comments. Give me some algorithm love and all that jazz. Thank you very much for this intermission break. This intermission is brought to you by water.
You made a great radio jockey.
I hope that means I'll be good at podcasting.
I don't see a difference, other than one's just more lucrative than the other.
Well, maybe we can switch that around. I don't need to be lucrative. I just want my little tree house on the hill. That's what I'd like. Just tuck me away. I don't even need a lot, really. But anyhow, so you know, talking about those perspectives, and to bring it back to you and your experience.
Well, I felt like this is something that rubbed me the wrong way. And again, this is another idea that I got introduced to, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to actually take some time. I'm going to sit with this, and I'm going to question myself. genuinely about
Sit
it.
with what?
When I'm trying to remember, it was sophomore year.
Excuse me.
I took a bunch of writing classes, but I never took English 101 until sophomore year. And I remember sophomore year, English 101, right out the gate, the whole theme for the class was white privilege.
Okay.
Like that was the whole semester was we were going to ask ourselves questions about white privilege, and we could deviate from that theme if we had an interesting idea that was related. I ended up writing my final paper about something as altogether different as I could, but it was an English 101, and I got presented. I'd heard about this before because I was watching a lot of YouTube. Family was into politics, so it was like I would hear. I heard about Milo Yiannopoulos. Like Milo Yiannopoulos is the one that kind of like convinced me that I would vote for Trump right at the end of my senior year of high school, because again, Milo Yiannopoulos, completely like outside, like I'm not gonna talk about Milo much. Point is, as I came up against in college, I was confronted with this question of, well, don't you think you have some implicit bias against certain people? And I remember thinking, well, yeah, like obviously I have some biases against people. Like I live in the world. I avoid some people, and I am attracted to other. I'm kind of magnetized to other people. I'm attracted to other people's personas and kind of freaked out by others. But it's like in this, it was told in this context of. I remember dwelling on that question of, do I have an implicit racial bias? Do I have a natural bias against black people? And I didn't. I simply didn't. Like I genuinely grew up either. I grew up trying to train myself to be colorblind because whenever I had a whole bunch of kids come to my house or come to my home, the context was never they're black or they're white. It was always, this is everybody else in the world. Like, aren't we lucky?
Was part of that they're poor?
Yeah, no, it was poor kids.
So it didn't matter what color they were, these are just poor kids.
Yeah, and there were usually more black kids than white kids that showed up to those angel tree camps.
But there were both.
Yeah, there were.
Were there Asians or Latin people, kids?
A few Latin kids, a few Hispanic kids.
But overall, in your kind of memory, it's black and white.
Yeah, it was. Like, for the most part, it was. And the white kids, the poor white kids, were always like super bad nerds.
Nerds?
Yeah, like they were always geeks.
Really?
Almost always.
It's odd.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I'm remembering that wrong or not, but it really doesn't seem like it.
It seems odd to me,
but it was like, I don't know, I think I was around 5 or 6. There was this kid who was a few years older than me, and he was this gigantic, like he was an ugly kid. To me, he was enormous, and he was kind of fleshy, and he was ginger, and he had like these super puffy lips. He won a bad lottery ticket. But
he probably turned out really handsome later on.
I'm sure he did. God knows he dressed slicker than I have ever learned to. But he was a poor inner city kid, and I remember being 5 or 6, and his foster parents would come over and hang out with my mom and dad, and they would bring him, and he and I would play outside a lot. And I remember there was one day we disagreed about like what we wanted to do. And it got really heated, like, I don't want to go swimming. And I was like, I don't want to go swimming. We've been swimming the last 3 days. And and it was like, I remember this like petty little spat that we had.
Mm-hmm.
And it escalated to where we were like yelling at each other. And I remember saying, man, you always act like we gotta do what you wanna do, but what makes your life so bad that like you should get to call all the shots? And then I remember he got like really like, he got super upset, and I'll never forget him like going, why is my life so bad? You wanna know why? Cause like when I was a kid, all I can remember is my mom and dad taking the belt and beating me. That was all that I had growing up as a kid. I just remember getting beat on with the belt. That's what's so bad about my life. And then we like went and pouted on opposite sides of the yard for like 30 minutes. And then I remember like meandering over going, hey man, like I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you so upset. I was just being kind of a jerk. And he goes, no. He's like, I was being a jerk too. You want to go swimming? Yeah. I mean, it's a very innocuous, like, that was a very innocuous, very tiny, like, snippet of my life. But I never forgot that.
Sure.
I never forgot that. And that, like, honestly, like, one way or another, I give a lot of credit to my parents, because it was like, they weren't always the smartest with their money. They weren't always like, they weren't like these big captains of industry, like they were never gonna be. They were kind of like working class Joe Schmoes. Yeah. And just because we had this enormous family estate didn't change any of that.
Right.
But it was like just the goodwill of my parents to be like, well, as long as we have this, we're going to use it to everybody else's benefit as much as we can. And it's like,
and it's that we're gonna share the little bit that we have.
Yeah, whatever we have, like, we didn't do anything special to earn it. Like, we can share it.
Yeah, I kind of want to reiterate that this, you're not some rich kid by any means.
Well, and that's what I mean when I say, like, I got to college and suddenly I'm hearing about white privilege and how, like, I'm supposed to have this automatic bias against black people just because I am a little more see-through than the average.
You're a little bit more light-skinned.
Well,
than other people.
Well, I just remember, like, that was kind of the first time I thought to myself in college, like, oh, I am an outsider. Like, not because of the way I look, not because of the way I dress, not because of the way I speak, but just by virtue of the way my own thoughts are formed.
Yeah.
Though, just by virtue of the ideas.
Yeah.
That float through my head, like, I'm an outsider because, they're like, oh, what, are you going to say you're totally colorblind? And I was like, I mean, I'm not going to pretend like black people don't have a distinct look from what me and my family have. Obviously there's physical differences. But it was like, ever since I was like 5 or 6 years old, it's like, they got 5 fingers, they got 5 toes, they got 2 ears, they got 1 mouth, they got 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and half the time they're the most interesting people to talk to. Half the time they make better conversation than point is, it's like, a person is a person. If you were chatting with somebody in the DMs, you can typically like differentiate between somebody who's botting your DMs, who's sending you bot messages. You can tell the difference between that and an actual human being who's synthesizing thoughts and like typing them out and sending them. It's like, I guess that's just always kind of felt like it was part of my identity, was like, yeah, I am kind of colorblind because I kind of grew up separate from everyone else on planet Earth up until high school.
Yeah.
And then now that I'm out here in the world, like, I'm just kind of looking for an excuse to get along. And
Looking for an excuse to get along.
yeah, like, I don't know how to put it any more simply than that. But then it's like, I rant and rave about the education system a lot. Not because it doesn't provide like a baseline of information, not because there's no utility in it, not because it doesn't kind of absorb all of the child rearing and child care that a lot of people would be fucking up if they had to spend all day with their kids all week long. But it just kind of turns people into tools. Like the education system is designed to sculpt people into the most useful units. And there's nothing implicitly wrong with that. There's nothing immoral about that on its face. I don't know, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but it was like, I don't know, the irony is like, about 2 or 3 years ago, I had like this thought occurred to me. It was like, you know, whenever I start ranting and raving about conspiracy theories, I was like, there's always one demographic of people that are right on board with me from the jump. And that's always the black guys in the room.
Well,
and it's kind of like,
I think the black American community has a good reason to mistrust the government.
Well, and it was like,
historically,
I don't like the idea of white privilege. I think that's a very corrupt concept. I think it's a well that's been poisoned.
I think like anything, when you take it to an extreme and you just lump people into groups, you know, I also was presented with the ideas of white privilege, specifically in my seminary context. Man, this scratching the back of my throat, bro. Excuse me, I'm sorry for the unprofessionalism. I would like a cough drop sponsor. I think it's just, you know, a blanket term that for many people it means whatever they think it means. Yeah. I think that there are some ways in which I have experienced differences that maybe a person from a different perspective would call privilege. So, for instance, I'm in high school, near my 18th birthday, and I'm driving around on that part of town in a car full of friends, and everybody's black but me. And we get pulled over and say we're smoking some weed, right? There's a very big difference in how we were treated in that context by the police that pulled us over. Then when the same thing happened to me in the community that I started off in, same exact scenario, right? Car full of people, except for everybody's white. Now we're all poor white, but we're all white. And we're smoking big weed. And we get pulled over. I didn't even, in the black context, we're harassed. We're pulled out of the car. We're scared as fuck, like, about what could possibly happen. And that's not to say I'm not scared over in the white context, but ultimately the tone of that police officer is a lot different. Now, this could be just two individual officers. And I will say that in the black context, one of the officers was a black man, right? Mm-hmm. But they're police. The other context is just one man. So I don't know, I have to recognize that in the moment, things are what they are, and I'm using a very small sample size.
Yeah.
Right? A very small sample size. But, I felt that difference in policing. I felt that difference, and even in the black community. So I was part of in my senior year, I was part of this program where they help people get business-oriented jobs. I feel like the job that I got was one of the best ones that it was there, and I think I feel like I got it because I was white. My black teacher, I think, did that because she wanted to make sure that she kept that position open for future classes. I think that was her decision, but I think part of her decision was he's white, he'll fit in better, blah, 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 blah. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that's where I feel like there's this misnomer of white privilege, because I think a lot of people are making a lot of different decisions based on their own biases.
Yeah.
Now, with that said, am I ignorant of the fact that white people have created a grand economic base, and that as tribal people, as humans, we tend to be attracted to people that we can relate to a little bit more, and one of those things that we use for that is skin color and those biases and assumptions. Is it that we have cultural similarities that make us more comfortable, or is it simply because of the color of our skin? I think it's all of the above. Yeah. So when you have an old boys club, because it's been built by the old boys, and they want to bring in their boys, right? Like, to ignore the fact that we're tribal is to ignore, I think, a reality, and to ignore the fact that so far in the economic history of the United States, that white people have created, maintained, and controlled the economics, right? That there potentially is some white privilege there. I don't perceive it that way, especially economically, because I know that poor white people are oftentimes treated the same as poor black people. And I think that there is an overlay of socioeconomics that is sometimes ignored. And here, let me give you a really good example of when I realized how my Appalachian family was very, very similar to the black people that I have been meeting. Mama Cammie, my best friend's mother, who I call Mama Cammie, and she would tell, before she passed away, she would tell people that he's one of my sons. When we were teenagers, she took us to church. Mama Cammie went to church every Wednesday, every Sunday. She was in the church. If she wasn't at work, she was at church. And always really ingrained in the church. She was a finance person, a Ohio State graduate, worked for a very good company, and was a financial analyst. 1984, Who's Who. She's in a book of Who's Who. Like, this lady is no joke.
Mama Cammie was running shit.
Mama Cammie was intelligent. Mama Cammie was black, and she was a woman, and then in that time, it had its effects, because there's biases there too, right, for women. So Mama Cammie one day says to me, Antonio, and to another guy who was, I can't remember what he went by on the streets, but his real name was Gaylord. Gaylord wore a purple G-Lord. He wore a purple jean suit like every day, and he carried a 22. Anyway, Gaylord was with us. Mama came and was like, hey, I want y'all to go to church with me. And this is one of those moments where we said, hey, why not? It's not like she didn't invite us to church, me and Antonio, before, but, you know, we like, what the heck? And so we go to this very Baptist front, urban, on a very busy street, you know, avenue in the city, storefront Baptist church is how I'll describe it. And I'm the only white person in the whole room. And the celebration is loud, and there's a lot of drums, there's a lot of hollering, a lot of screaming, a lot of amens and hallelujahs, and it's just loud. That's what I remember about it. It's just loud. You know? The tambourines and the drums and the hollering and yelling, and it just echoes off the walls in this small compartment of a space, you know. And you know, and I'm at this point, I'm aware, you know, I've dated black women at this time. I've been around the black culture and heard about soul food and tasted soul food and all that. And what I realize is that it really isn't much different than my Appalachian family. We love chicken and watermelon too. I never understood why it was black people's soul food. It was country food to me. This is poor people food to me. Anyway, so when my grandfather passes away, I attend his church for the first time. Now, this is a church that my grandfather in his old age sat out front and read scripture while everybody else was building. He was unable to work, and so he would come in and sit down, and he'd just open up his Bible. He'd read the Bible out loud while everybody's working. And I go to this funeral. It's not quite as loud, but it's a little bit bigger space, and it's out in the country. But it's the same, essentially the same Baptist celebration, worship. It's the same food. It's the same worship.
You live a humdrum 9-to-5 existence, 5 to 6 days a week, and then on Sunday morning, you make life feel meaningful.
I don't. Maybe that was the case for them. I don't know. But my point is that the only difference in these two groups of people was skin color and rural versus urban. But they worship. The two things that I think are like the pillars of life: diet and worship. We're the same. Yeah. And yet these are two groups of people that probably, I don't know,
don't associate.
They don't associate. But if you were to commingle them, would they get along? You know, even though they have the same faith and the same diet, you know. And later on I learned from Thomas Sowell, you know Thomas Sowell? Yeah. I learned that a lot of black culture comes from redneck culture in the South. Yeah. And you'll hear that when you hear a Southern person talking, and they may not talk Ebonics, but they got their own way of talking. And if you listen, especially in the Midwest, where you talk like this, and you got people talking like this here and that there, and da 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 do 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 da da da, like that's not only black culture, it's country culture. Yeah. And so that influences the way that I look at white privilege. Because to me, there's socioeconomic privilege. There are privileges that I have. I do believe that. And maybe it was a blessing to me, but I know that when I went to court, oftentimes as a young kid for shoplifting and for this and that. Mm-hmm. Now, my mom is a courtroom mafiosa. My mom knows how to say the right things, and my mom shows up. But they believe her when she says, I'm gonna handle it. As a single woman, as a single mother, I'm gonna handle it. Whereas I don't know if my black friends' parents would believe the same way when they said, I'm gonna handle it. You understand? So specifically in the United States context, because I think greater worldwide, like that's part of an issue that I have with a lot of the people in the United States is we are so localized to the United States context that we're totally oblivious to what's actually going on in the rest of the world, and that black in Africa like is different, Black Caribbean is different. Black Brazilian is different. Like there's to pretend that any group of people, whatever box and label you want to put them on, is some kind of monolithic group where they all think and believe and act and accord with some kind of thing. To me, that's just racist. That's what makes you racist, is the idea that you're just gonna lump everybody together. You know.
Well, and let me be clear. When I say I'm very cynical about the idea of white privilege, what I'm not saying is I don't believe in racism.
Sure.
I'm not saying that people don't have even temperamental, a lot of it's nurture, probably the majority of it's nurture. But like, it's not like people don't have temperamental biases as it is at rock bottom. It's not like people don't have kind of an aversion to strangeness, point blank.
Yeah.
And it's not that I don't think that there, upon thousands of police departments and school boards and government agencies that have had an express interest in belittling black people. It's not that I don't believe any of that. It's that my problem with the idea of white privilege is more like, I don't know if this is necessarily a military tactic strategy, but have you ever heard of that old sleight of hand, that old trick of, if you're in charge of a bunch of young people, if you're in charge of a small unit of people and they're all acting up, they're all misbehaving, one thing you can do is you can try to punish everybody, and you can change the rules, and you can bring that iron fist down. Another way of going about it is single one person out and give them special privileges. Give them extra resources, give them extra luxuries, and then watch everybody else kind of come together against that one enemy. That's kind of how white privilege sounds to me. Is it sounds like it's obfuscating the actual dilemma, the actual problem, which, in my experience, if you want to distill, if you want to inundate the racist attitudes out of a kid's head, stick them in a situation where they have to make friends with somebody who doesn't look like them. If you can, because one friend that I've had that looked and sounded and was culturally very different from me, one friend that I've had many friends like that, but just a single friend has been more than capable of completely like expanding my horizons. Like, that's what I look for in my friends, is people who kind of enrich my perspective. And like you were saying, like, it's the inner city black culture and the rural Appalachian white guy culture, the white Appalachian culture, they hit these same beats. Like, they share, if they share nothing else, they share this very human expression and when put in very similar circumstances. Like, we're on the outside, we're on the margins. Like, we don't fit neatly inside the box. And it just reminds me of in the Roaring '20s, William Randolph Hearst and some skeevy politician, I don't remember his name, but they took it upon themselves, they conspired to basically freak the whole country out about weed. They conspired to freak the whole country out about the devil's lettuce, that Mexican tobacco. you know, these black people are bringing the ganja in, and it's corrupting our
Native
white
Americans and
neighborhoods.
Mexicans.
And the incentive for that was because, this is probably a generalization, but to a large degree, it was because of jazz clubs. Because black people were going and playing jazz music in these clubs in the cities, and they were making some of the best music. So everybody wanted to go see and hear the music. Everybody went and hung out at these jazz clubs. So there was this kind of, I want to say 4 or 5 year period of time where it was like white people and black people were hanging out, smoking a joint, and listening to really good trombone music. And that was becoming kind of a cultural staple of these cities. You don't I don't think that it is. I don't think, like I was saying, there's a human experience in Appalachia and the inner city church. There's a human expression that they share in common. And I don't think that I think the natural human expression is to kind of want to just get along, looking for an excuse to get along. But there's these deliberate actions, these deliberate movements, these, what do they call it in philosophy? Yeah, there's these moves people make that punctuate the equilibrium, like they stir shit up. And to me, it's like that idea of the white privilege of, well, here's who's really oppressing you. Like, here's who's really got it out for you. This is who you should be paranoid about all hours of the day, because trust us, they're thinking about you.
You know, I think in the United States context, to ignore that there are people right now who met a grandparent who was a slave, or a grandparent whose parent was a slave, to have met a person that grew up during the Jim Crow eras and that lived through the civil rights era, that that is aware of the United States history. To pretend that there wasn't a intentional segregation invented and maintained. You know, we watch the United States being probably the first country that's going to mix, you know, on these lands is the first time that races are actually going to mix in the way that they have been mixed here. You don't see this kind of diversity in China or India. You don't see this kind of diversity in Africa, right? In Africa, their races are based on tribal affiliations. Like, they're all black, but they see each other as different races. And scientifically, biologically, they are. And it's no different than old Europeans when you had these different tribes that were doing that. But as we come to the United States, we have this very different thing, and that is the fact that we have all the races in one place at one time. Now, it's ugly, it's conquest, it's slavery, and it's not that they created slavery. Slavery had been going on since, I think the only profession older than slavery is prostitution. And I'd wager that they probably exist hand in hand throughout time. In any culture and anywhere in the world, there's been those things, but the United States is unique. The Americas are unique because we have the natives, we have Africans, we have Europeans, we have Asians, and a lot of people would look at the Native Americans as a extension of the Asians as far as race is concerned. And so it's brand fucking new, man. we've never been in this context before. And yeah, well, okay, so here's our starting point. Our starting point is white people spreading out, genocide, slavery. Okay, fine. And there's this creation of these tribal differences to say that we're better than you and you're this and we're that and blah blah blah. And we get to a point where, slavery's all over the world. It's actually white people that start going, we're going to do something about it. We're going to use our economic power. Mr. Wilberforce, who has a university named after him because of this, says, I'm going to push to make slavery and the slave trade illegal. And they do so. Like, no other country had made slavery illegal until Britain. It's not illegal until Britain does, right? And I think people forget this, that there's this movement of human liberty, and the people with economic power were the technological economic power that Europe exerted on the world during that time. And let's remember, the only reason why they're exerting on the rest of the world, because they just lost to the Middle East and the Muslim caliphates. So they're not necessarily the big dogs. They just fucking lost big time. Literally 1492, the year the Columbus sails the ocean blue, is the year that they finally give up the Crusades. And they're like, we're not going to try to take over the Middle East anymore because we've lost. Right? We're talking about, Byzantium's actually falling, and people don't realize like how significant that point in time is and why the Europeans are going, we need to find this new route to India because them tea and spices are so good, and them damn Muslims, well, they controlled the trade, and we didn't want to pay them. Economics on me. Anyway, I was trying to bring it around to this point that I want to make, and that is we have to recognize this is the first time that we've done this.
Well, I think that's something you and I have in common, is we both fundamentally believe in the melting pot.
I believe in the salad bowl, but go ahead.
But the point is, I think we both agree that, there's no reason why just human beings can't get along.
I mean, we're tribal and we're working. That's my point. We're working through that. We're continuing to work through that.
But
to ignore the history of white privilege, okay? Because at one point there were literally signs on restaurants, whites only, right? That's privilege.
I mean, even technically.
And to ignore the fact that just because the laws said it was no longer, to pretend that people just changed, it's not realistic.
Do you see what I mean, though, when I say, okay, technically, yes, you can point to things that are factually, you got a privilege here because you were white. Technically, yeah, it's a real phenomenon. But I don't think that's what sticks in people's heads.
Well, and that's the danger of these blanket kind of statements, and it just creates another form of racism, right? Mm-hmm. Because people aren't looking at the particulars, and and here's the other part. Those privileges going away. When you start having affirmative action, today, right now, the weakest person is a straight, white, Christian male. Right now, in today's world, we have the least amount of privilege. We are not going to be hired because of our skin color. We're not going to be hired because of our gender or sexuality. We are going to be looked over for other races, for other genders and sexualities, right? It's in the laws now, right? They're creating more and more laws to effectuate that. Now, is it a counterbalance to the old boys club scenario? Sure, but what they miss out is not everybody had the old boys scenario. I can tell you right now that my grandfather didn't feel any kind of white privilege.
Yeah.
He was a poor Appalachian. He was treated no better than any other poor person in the United States. And there's a lot of rich people that would look at him as if he were a N-word. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
And that's the thing.
My grandmother too. She comes from Hispanic people. Like there's nothing privileged about her. There was nothing privileged about my uncles. Nobody was coming to hand them crap, except maybe a church bringing some green beans and some hominy because they realized that there was no food in their house. You understand what I'm saying? Like that, and I think I'm agreeing with you.
I think so.
In the respect that, it is dangerous to put a blanket statement on anybody and then associate them and be like, oh, you're white and therefore you have this and this and that and that. Or you're black and therefore you have this and this and that and that.
It's the whole idea of the privilege. Just every time I hear that, I feel like I have alarm bells ringing in my head. That's like, hey, if somebody's given this person this privilege, maybe if somebody wants you to have this meme in your head. Mm-hmm. Somebody wants you to have this idea. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I think it works the same way with crotchety old white people telling their grandkids, now you stay away from those black boys and girls. You stay away from the black side of town because they're strange over there.
Yeah.
There's an agenda there, I think, in the same way that there's an agenda constant, like English 101, my English 101 class. Mm-hmm. There's it's kind of the same sleight of hand, and it doesn't have anything. Look, point is, regardless of how many black people to how many white people you have in a country, you have a lot of people, and you need to organize them. You need to shape. You need to shape them. You need to manufacture some sort of collective identity for big groups of people. I'm saying this from the perspective of somebody who's running a country. But you have these divisions, these constant memes being put in your head of, oh, well, this is like, it's the Jews, it's the blacks, it's the whites. It's like, it's useful to keep people in that cynical state of like suspicious of everyone else.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, essentially.
We are divided, so who's conquering us? And I'm gonna work to wrap this up a little bit. And I want to say that I think that anytime that we look at the word privilege, I think we should all look at our privileges. We should all look at the things that our ancestors have brought to us up to this point in today. We should all count our blessings for the things that we have. You want to talk about privilege? I don't care who you are in the United States. I guarantee you that you're more privileged than most people in the rest of the world, including even Europe. Maybe not Europe. But I guarantee you that that you have rights here that most other people don't experience. You have more safety here that most people don't normally experience. Don't get me wrong, there's some bad neighborhoods. I get it. The world is a chaotic mess. We all have some privileges and we all have things that are going to hold us back. I think that the ideas that I want to express in our podcast is to open our perspectives, from our own individual perspective and to reach out and to look at other perspectives. Whether that's, chatting online with people from different countries and different areas, or watching movies, or looking into, traveling. But if you do it from, I'm just better than everybody else and I'm looking down my nose, and I've seen black, white, it don't matter, people with money do it. Americans are real bad about it, all forms of Americans, all colors of Americans. But if you really look around, we all have our blessings and our privileges. And we will make this world a better place. And it's one point, because today is the celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday. And And I feel that when I was a young person in high school, I felt like we were closer to Martin's dream than we are today. I think we have digressed, and we are looking at color of skin, gender, and sexuality. We're looking at outside labels and boxes to judge and classify people instead of looking at the content of their character. And as I wrap this up today, I'd like to reiterate that I hope one day that little boys and girls can play with each other and it won't matter. Thanks for watching. See you next time. This is Cousin Chet, Dill again. We're out.